You just because you love me. Because I'm
I
awesome.
don't
Oh, jeez. So yes. No, that was sorry. Did we get Oh, that's right. I forgot. He went all the way over to. Yeah. I think everybody's here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 8, 9. Yeah. Yeah.
It's 7 o'clock. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Could we all rise, please, for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Test 1 2. Test 1 2.
I'm making, I won't talk. Snap, crackle, pop. So I won't touch it and make everything go snap, crackle, pop. Before I turn the meeting over to Mr. Medancy, our superintendent, I'd just like to say thank you to the members of the Townwide Facility Committee who have gotten us here to this evening. The work has been long. We've had some detours and turns, but we're finally here with the presentation. So I would just like to say thank you to all the members from the Town Council, the Board of Finance and Planning and Zoning who sat in on the meetings and gave recommendations and shared thoughts with us to get us here tonight. So thank you to all who participated. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Mr. Medancy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Oh, sorry.
Loud.
Good evening. I'd like to thank members of the community for attending or streaming this evening as we embark on an important conversation regarding the future of our elementary facilities. While the entire plan will most likely impact many more families than simply Flanders, Kelly, and Daranoski, with associated redistricting that we will touch upon this evening, it should be noted that these are the 3 remaining elementary school buildings in district to undergo any substantive work since original construction. The town and the Board of Education have been reviewing various scenarios dating back to 2022 on these buildings and considered various options during this time. The initial proposal back in 2022 was to close Flanders and build a larger Kelly Elementary School. At the time, there were some concerns at the Department of Administrative Services Office of School Construction up at the state and whether the input we had received regarding eligible reimbursement costs would hold, given that the executive director at the time had just been removed from the position and was under federal investigation. The district instead decided to go forward with a referendum for the high school athletic facilities at that time. In 2023, with the same recommendation on the table, no action was taken as there were concerns of too large of a Kelly Elementary School and jeopardizing the neighborhood school model, coupled with enrollment projections that didn't justify closing any of our schools at that point in time. In 2024, no recommendations or action was taken, given that the town was already putting forward a substantial request to referendum for funding of road projects, staying on a cycle established by our former town manager. Finally, 2025. After reconvening the district-wide facilities committee, consideration for prior concerns was given, including building elementary schools larger than desired, maintaining the neighborhood model to the best extent possible, and balancing enrollment where possible, all while staying within the parameters of an established debt service policy of no more than 9.5% of the annual town budget. That brings us to this evening's presentation. In closing, I'd like to thank the volunteer members of our district-wide facilities committee for making themselves available for numerous meetings to discuss various options and scenarios leading up to tonight's meeting. Having unanimous consensus of tonight's recommended scenario amongst those present at our last meeting is a strong indicator of the collaboration and consideration that has occurred thus far between all town boards and appointed officials. So at this time, I would like to welcome up Pat Gallagher from MP Planning Group. Pat has been working with the district for the past several years on the enrollment study and as well as our facilities study relative to capacity in our various buildings. And he's going to be presenting the first portion of our scenario.
Thanks for that. Thank you for that introduction, and good evening, everybody. Again, my name is Pat Gallagher. I'm a principal with MP Planning Group, and I'm going to kick us off tonight and then pass over to my colleagues from Colliers and Studio Jade to fill in some of the missing pieces as we go through the presentation here. So as the superintendent noted, this has been a long process that has begun many years ago. And today, really at the culmination of a lot of that due diligence work that we've performed ever since 2002. And as the superintendent noted, the impetus for this project was how do we address conditions at those last three remaining buildings that have not undergone a substantial renovation in recent memory, while also right-sizing facilities to current enrollment trends and considering other things like the town's ability to fund those improvements. So our work has really been multifaceted and multi-phased, and it's really started very broad and gotten more focused over the years. And the first phase of the work really focused on enrollment projections, looking at current and projected enrollment over a 10-year period, and then comparing that to the size of your buildings and the way that you educate your students today. Are your buildings overused, underused, or somewhere in between? And that led us to a review of some initial planning options. That then narrowed our focus, and we were able to do some additional due diligence and analysis to help provide some greater information to aid in our decision-making process. So this includes site due diligence, so looking at those three sites and the ability to accommodate new construction, test fits, which is just a process where you do some initial sketches to see how that would look. Some more detailed scenario planning, which included some high-level cost estimating, and then finally, facility condition assessments. So looking at those three buildings today and saying, what are the needs of those spaces if we were to do nothing, and we needed to just address those condition items in those three buildings. And then ultimately leading into our final phase, which is the impetus for tonight's meeting, is discussing those preferred scenarios and moving towards that school construction grant application in June. So I'll start with enrollment projections. We did an initial study, I believe, back in 2018, and then updated it with a comprehensive enrollment and capacity study back in 2022. And a lot of the same drivers that we identified back in 2022 are still occurring. So Southington is a growing community. You added almost 500 residents between the last two censuses, and the latest estimates show that that growth has continued. And in Connecticut, many of your peer communities were either stable or shrinking during that period. We've also seen increasing births and elevated births, especially in 2021, 2022, and 2024. And in the enrollment projection world, higher births usually corresponds with larger kindergarten classes. And so we account for those larger kindergarten classes entering your school district starting in the fall of 2026. Housing market also dramatically impacts your enrollment because it impacts people's ability to move into town. We saw a large uptick in home sales in 2020 and 2021. This was the trend we saw throughout the region and state, including a record number of single-family sales in 2021. But what we've seen over the last several years is that the home sale market has cooled substantially, largely due to national trends around high prices, high interest rates. And so now sales are trending well below those pandemic highs. And then new construction. You're a community that has built a lot of single-family housing in a time when a lot of your peer communities have really seen a stagnant single-family market. So you have averaged 85 new single-family homes over the last 5 years, including several larger subdivisions. So these are all things that are driving your enrollment trends within your school district. So we updated the projections using the fall of 2024 data. And the projections are largely on the same trajectory with a slight downward revision due to some slowed in migration due to the housing market and a small kindergarten class that we saw this year, which is largely tied to that change in entry age that we switched to this year, where we had a smaller number of students eligible to enroll in kindergarten. Overall, we're looking at our pre-K through 12th grade enrollment to grow slowly, reaching just under 6,500 students by year 10. Focusing in on the elementary schools, which is the focus of our work, we're expecting modest growth at the elementary level over the next 5 years, reaching about 2,750 students, and then growing to just under 2,850 students at the peak. For comparison, your last peak in the late 2000s, your elementary enrollment K-5 was about 3,100 students. So while we're projecting growth, we're still expecting that growth to be below that peak that you saw about 15 years ago. We're also expecting some modest growth at the middle school as some of those larger elementary classes start to move up. And then the high school, we're projecting relatively stable enrollment at around 2,000 students. We also performed by school projections, highlighting the peak projected enrollment at each of your schools. And so under current conditions, we're expecting South End and Thalberg to grow the most over the next 5 years at more than 5% each. We're also expecting modest growth at Strong, Flanders, Hatton, and Kelly. And 2 schools, we're projecting some modest decreases at Daranoski and Oceana. We also did a refresh of our capacity study that we did back in 2022, knowing that back in 2022, you were still operating in somewhat of a COVID era policy with some smaller class sizes. So we just wanted to make sure that the capacity study reflected operations as of 2024. When we develop the capacity, we base it on the number of instructional classrooms, any rooms that could be used for K-5 instruction that maybe aren't this year due to lower enrollment, and then we make adjustments for any deficiencies that we see. And then we use the district's maximum loading levels, which it uses when it determines the staffing for each of the schools. And so we have lower loading levels at kindergarten, and then the max loading levels go up, reaching up to 24 for grades 3 through 5. And then we also account for self-contained programs, such as those at Daranoski, Hatton, and Kelly. I will note that we decreased the overall capacity slightly since the last study, largely due to some deficiencies in art and music rooms in 2 schools in South End and Thalberg, which have undersized rooms for those support services. So we actually reduced the capacity at those buildings relative to usage to really hit that optimal target. And overall, for neighborhood-based schools like Southington, we can never achieve the maximum capacity because students don't come neatly packed in every grade. And so 85 to 90% of the maximum is really the ideal target that ensures efficient operations while maintaining those class size targets, while minimizing some of those operational impacts. So this shows our projected utilization under the status quo. So this compares our projected enrollment to the capacity of each of the buildings. And again, note 85 to 90% utilization is really the ideal target for districts that group by neighborhood like Southington. And what you can see is that if we focus on the district-wide number, today we are at about 76% utilization. That's projected to average about 77% utilization over the next 5 years and then grow to the low 80s over the final years of the projection. So we're staying slightly below that ideal operating target. And only 2 buildings, Thalberg and South End, are going to be operating within that 85 to 90% range over the next 10 years. While some schools, such as Flanders, will be utilized less than 70%. So having that baseline really helped inform our elementary facilities plan. Having that information relative to enrollment and capacity is an important consideration, but obviously there are other considerations as well. And so what scenarios did we consider? And so we considered a range of scenarios looking at doing nothing, so status quo, doing projects at all 3 schools, closing a school without adding more space at one of the other 2 buildings, and then looking at just replacing Daranoski at the same size it is today, and then replacing Daranoski with a smaller school and fitting out that space in South End. And we created a series of criteria to really help in the decision-making process to weigh the pros and cons of the different options. There's never an option that's perfect, that's going to hit all of the different goals and objectives that the district and town want to accomplish. But at the end of the day, one of the key drivers for us is looking at it from an operational standpoint, trying to hit that efficient operational target for all of your buildings, and also keeping in mind that in order to get the state to partner with the district on these projects, we need to justify the amount of space that we build. So we don't want to build too much space. We don't want to build too little space. We want to really be in that Goldilocks range where we're building just the right amount of space. And a similar approach can be taken for your community members. Ultimately, these projects are going to be dependent on a referendum. And so it's making the case to the community that we're building the right amount of space, not too much, not too little. And ultimately, the scenario that we're going to present this evening was determined to really meet the best or have the best balance of those many competing objectives. So scenario D does have the closure of Flanders as one of its elements. And so I wanted to touch on why close Flanders. Ultimately, it came down to right sizing your school portfolio to enrollment. So again, not overbuilding and not underbuilding. If we were to replace all 3 schools, we would continue to operate below that ideal 85 to 90% target. And so in addition to obviously having higher construction costs, it also has higher operational costs for operating 3 schools versus the 2. We also looked at whether Flanders was the right school to close. We also looked at Kelly as well, and some of the reasons why Flanders was ultimately chosen. Flanders has the smallest enrollment out of the 3 schools being considered for construction and the lowest utilization. The location of Flanders relative to other schools also makes it easier to redistrict. If Kelly were to close, for example, we would have no school in the whole northwest quadrant of town. And so the attendance zones would really have to deviate from that neighborhood-based model in order to fit all of those students. The Kelly site is also larger and more favorable for new construction. We work in a lot of districts that have undertaken renovation projects, and I'm sure all of them will tell you, any district that's undertaken a renovation project with the kids still in the building will tell you that it is not ideal. There's educational impact. And so one of the due diligence efforts was to look at the 3 sites and say, can we fit a new school on an undeveloped portion of that site and keep the existing school operational so that we're not disrupting the education of the students during construction. And Kelly is a more ideal site than Flanders because of its size and configuration. With Flanders being smaller and also irregularly shaped, kind of like a bow tie, with the school being right in the center of the bow tie. And with Flanders, the existing location of the school is really the ideal location on that site. And so you'd have to build the new school in a less optimal area in order to make it work. The superintendent and his team also did an operational analysis that looked at some of the expense savings with closing Flanders. And I'll leave this up here. And I'm sure him and his team could answer any questions should they come up. But this again aligns with that fiscal element to our work. And before we get into the details of scenario D, we thought it was really important to kind of tee us up with comparing that to the status quo. So what happens if we do nothing? I'll start by just taking a look at what the configuration of your system would look like. Obviously, it would look the same as today, but we would have to invest in those three buildings, Flanders, Daranoski, and Kelly, to really bring them up to par with the remaining elementary school students. As I noted before, we're looking at a peak utilization of about 81% district-wide. So we'll remain below that ideal 85 to 90% target. And I'll turn over to Pam to talk about what are some of the maintenance and facility condition implications under that status quo.
Good evening. My name's Pamela Babuka, and I'm with Studio Jade. We're an architectural engineering and design firm. And a component of what we specialize in is performing facility condition assessments, but we're identifying the current conditions, right? What's your existing state? And before I go much further, I do want to just let you know, I believe these documents, including any of the charts that you see up here, will be available through your website. Okay, so if you are interested in getting those, they will be available. So overall, what our project scope was is we walk through the buildings. So that's a team of architects and engineers, both mechanical, electrical, and plumbing. And we go through the building and we're looking for what is the current state of your equipment? What are the conditions of everything from the inside to the outside, right? So whether it's starting from the moment you pull onto the property, so the driveways, the sidewalks, the access into the structure itself. And we go from the building envelope, which is the roof, everything on the outside, the physical structure itself, all the way into and deep down into the belly of the building and all those nooks and spaces. So we are looking overall, we're looking at what it would take to renew each of those systems and equipment over the period of the next 10 years, okay? And ultimately, I trying to identify what those line items or projects would look like and the costs associated to them. The scope, as you see, is very specific. For us, was just to the 3 elementary schools. And in that process, we go through and work with your team, develop some standards, so we were all looking at things in the same way, and then conducted the on-site assessments and went through the process. I'm not sure how familiar you are with each of these schools, and 4 pictures definitely doesn't capture it. So I apologize for that, but I just do want you to be able to recognize there are some conditions that are pretty obvious when you're walking through these buildings. Each of them have an element to their building envelope that are, I would say, compromised. When we're looking at new construction, we're always trying to make sure our first objectives when we're doing renovations is providing spaces that are warm, safe, and dry, right? So anything that's about making sure it stays dry from the outside, whether it's the roof, exterior walls, your windows, what that impact is on your heat and the energy conversation, and the equipment that you can see there, as well as the actual spaces where education is being taught and you're inspiring future learners. So you can see in each of these cases, there are different elements in each building, but this just kind of helps you get a glimpse of what some of those spaces and equipment look like. So this page represents really all of the data that we collected, and it's rolled up to its highest level. In the upper left-hand corner, you'll see a chart that provides a breakdown of our data. And we break everything into 4 categories. So we try to project what is the recommended timeline or the sense of urgency for when something should happen. There are 4 categories. The first one is immediate, which strictly means it's something that we're recommending would happen within the next calendar year. High is within 3 years, medium within 5 years, and low within 10 years. And we do that because it's important for us to recognize that across, if you would look, just adding up the first 2 categories, you have 74% of your needs are all bundled in the first 3 years. And that, again, 74% of the needs over 10 years, right, for all 3 schools is in the first 3 years, where 90% of the needs are captured within 5 years based off of good architectural and engineering practice. What that tells us is that you have a lot of systems and equipment in your buildings that your facilities team are managing well past their existing useful life, right? So, so good job for them. It's a lot of extra work. It also means that you're definitely not getting the energy conservation that you would, and that you will experience when you do renovations. And so it's not a quick fix, right? You didn't get here overnight and it won't get fixed overnight, but that my job is to help you see where you are. All right. So 74% was in the first 3 years, but collectively, again, over the full 10 years, the projection is $116.4 million. Okay. Now, once you back off of that, of like, what is the dollar look like? We like to get it past that to say, what are the things that are drawing the most amount of dollars? So on the right-hand side is the chart that shows it by system. We break things down into approximately 8 categories. Building envelope, again, is the kind of the wrapping. It's the walls, the roof, the windows, and the doors. Okay, what gets you around the structure of the building? So the building envelope. Electrical, fire alarm, that's pretty self-explanatory. Interior architecture is more related to finishes and interior construction, so the status of your interior walls, but floors, ceilings, walls, what the needs are there. Mechanical and plumbing. Site improvements are related to driveways, sidewalks, anything that might be related to the grounds itself, if there was playground equipment, those types of things. And space adaptations also include things related to, if you were to do a renovation, a major renovation, you'd be required to do improvements like, for example, to your bathrooms to make sure they were all compliant to today's codes. Any doorways that are not the correct width opening, all of those things would be required to be addressed. So we included those things in our assessment. When you break that down, you'll see that 36% of the needs, again, across 10 years for all 3 schools, is selected to mechanical systems. And so there's a lot of your focus needs are right there. And the pie chart is just giving you another visual for that. Second to that is the interior architecture at 20, and then electrical at 16%. When we look at that data right now, you're just looking at everything pushed together into one. We like to kind of parse that data out into 2 different levels of report so you can see how each school fares against the other. In this one, we're just looking at by priority. All right, so it's not about what's causing the dollars, but which one, where the dollars are falling. So when we look at this, we're really looking at the priority in the vertical column. So we're comparing the dollars and the percentages. So you can see, and the highlighted, though, in the pink, the highlighted there, that is indicating which one had the highest in the top 15% of dollars across there. All right, so it's not a surprise just based off of square footage, but this does help you see where the percentage of dollars breaks out across the 3 schools. Similar, we look at this again across breaking out each of the schools by systems. And this one tells a little bit more of a story. In this case, you will see that the highlights bounce around a little bit. So Dernosky has, out of all 3 schools, the highest cost per gross square footage. So what we do is we're not just looking at total dollars, we're comparing the dollars to the total square footage. So it normalizes that so we can really understand and appreciate what's causing a greater need. So Dernosky has the highest cost per gross square foot in both mechanical and electrical. Now, there's some differences between Kelly and Flanders ultimately, but when you look across all the way to the far right, you will see that we stacked the order of this by the total cost per gross square footage. So even though Dernosky is larger, when we're looking at this, we're normalizing it to the cost per gross square footage, and you'll see that the dollars for each of them are listed to the far right.
Thank you, Pam. So to summarize our status quo, we always like to say that the status quo doesn't have the lowest cost always, right? There's always a cost associated with it. And so the significant capital needs is certainly playing into our decision making of doing nothing still has a substantial cost implication for the community. Our overall utilization will remain below that 85 to 90% target. And if we do nothing, enrollment balance will continue to exist between your schools. So we have quite a range today with a low of 66% at Flanders and a high of 85% at Alberta over the next 5 years if we do nothing. And we've had several satellite zones that have been introduced over the years as a result of some of these enrollment balances that deviate from that neighborhood-based model that you strive for. And then similarly, discrepancy between the size of the buildings, from a high of over 700 students at Daranoski from a capacity standpoint to a low of just over 300 students at Oceana and South End. So these are all things that are current to the district today that would remain under that status quo. This map here just shows your current attendance zones with the stars highlighted over the three satellite areas. So moving into our recommended scenario D, the recommended scenario has two phases. Phase 1 being a June of 2025 application and a 2025 referendum, where we are proposing a new Kelly at 4 sections per grade, which is larger than the facility today, which is a 3-section per grade school. We are also recommending the expansion of South End. So that school was designed to support a future fit out of 5 classrooms on the lower level of that building. And that was determined to be more cost effective than trying to build that space as part of the future Daranoski project, while also allowing us to shrink the size of Daranoski. The closure of Flanders and any redistricting would occur upon the completion of these building projects, once that new space is infused within the district. So we're talking about fall of 2029 at the earliest based on the construction schedule. The phase 2 of the project tentatively would be a 2028 referendum, would build a new Daranoski at 4 sections per grade, which is a smaller facility than today, and also would look to build a new Karen Smith Academy on the Daranoski site. So all of the redistricting that is associated with this scenario is anticipated to occur after those phase 1 projects are completed. So we're not anticipating any additional redistricting after those phase 2 projects are completed. So this here just shows that bubble diagram of what the district would look like with these projects completed. So overall, we would be looking at a slight reduction in the overall capacity of the district. So we lose about 300 seats through the loss of Flanders, the shrinking of Daranoski, but also adding some seats at Kelly to offset that. That would result in a peak projected utilization of 88%, which is right in that sweet spot in that ideal operations between 85 and 90%. We also updated the capacity based on the draft ed spec documents that have been prepared as part of this project. So this just shows what the enrollment targets of those 3 building projects would be. So when we're looking at kind of operations, our enrollment target, which is 90% of the maximum capacity, is really kind of that number we're striving for. At Daranoski and Kelly, we're looking at just over 500 students each, and South End coming in at 379 students. So both Daranoski and Kelly would be built as a 4-section per grade school with an extra kindergarten classroom, so 25 instructional classrooms each, as well as self-contained programs. And South End would operate then as a 3-section per grade school with 19 K-5 classrooms. So we had to prepare conceptual boundaries to support the district's grant application, but at this stage, these boundaries are just that. They are conceptual. These are in sand. Having done a number of redistricting plans over the years, the boundaries really need to be finalized the fall before they go into effect, so that we can account for the most recent enrollment. We may be trending low or high. There may be new housing that we need to account for. And so at this point, this map here is just for kind of demonstration purposes as a proof of concept. And so should the district move forward with these phase 1 projects, this map would be finalized in the fall of 2028 for a fall of 2029 implementation. And again, we use this map in part to prepare the enrollment projections to support the grant application. The state uses the peak 8-year projected enrollment as part of the grant application process. And our redistricting, in addition to filling out the new space at South End and Kelly, is also looking at trying to balance enrollment across all buildings. So, students who are not living within the 3 buildings that will be part of the major construction plan may still be impacted by some of these smaller changes we'll need to balance out enrollment. And so this conceptual projection here shows our peak projected enrollment aligning largely with that 90% target at Daranoski, Kelly, and South End. Which, the goal would be to try to maximize reimbursement because the state bases your reimbursement on that peak projected enrollment. We also did that utilization exercise under scenario D. Again, if we look at the district-wide number first, we're expecting the district to move into that ideal 85 to 90% range starting in 28, 29 and remaining there over the later years of the projections. And in green are the schools that are within that target. And what you'll notice is a lot more green compared to the status quo. So we have a lot more schools really in that ideal operational efficiency. So again, these boundaries would be fine-tuned in 2028, leading up to the opening of those two projects in 2029, and would again kind of follow that same philosophy of trying to balance enrollment across all the buildings. So to summarize scenario D before I pass it off to the Colliers team, so the phase 1 grant application, then that's the one that will be going forward for this June, if approved, would be for a new Kelly and an expansion of South End. And again, construction anticipated to be completed for the 2029-2030 school year. And the closure of Flanders would not occur until those projects are completed. So 4 years from now at the earliest. And then followed by a phase 2 process with the new Daranoski and Karen Smith Academy with a June of 2028 application and a second referendum for those projects. And I'll pass it off to Colliers.
Thank you, Pat. Good evening. My name is Chuck Warrington. I'm a director of project management with Colliers Project Leaders. We're based out of Madison, Connecticut. We're an owner's project management firm, and I lead our Connecticut K-12 public sector over the last 5 or 6 years. We specialize all across the state, and we've executed many projects, many new elementary schools over, excuse me, probably over the last 10 years successfully. So we're very familiar with this. We've been through it quite a few times. I thought we'd just walk you through, what does the plan look like? What's the schedule look like? And the next two slides are going to show you graphically kind of what are the steps in the process, because these are big projects. They can be intimidating. We want to make sure we're educating everyone. Okay, what are the steps? And we're going to get into the costs as well. In this slide here, that red line you see kind of on the left, and the text is a little bit small, so I apologize. That green section of bars is really our pre-referendum studies over the last couple of years ourselves with MP Planning, the district, and Studio Jade. There's a lot of work that goes into these to plan, as you've seen in the prior slides. Between now and June, and that you kind of see that lighter red bar, and you see that red text box, that's that June 30th date. That's a statutory deadline for any district in Connecticut to submit a grant application for a new, either a new school renovation project that would be submitted to the state for consideration actually next year. So that's our deadline that we're working towards. And if this is approved, we'd be preparing all the documents necessary to submit to the state. Those include enrollment projections that Pat and his team have prepared. There'd be additional motions that have to be passed by the town council, budgets, estimates, et cetera, to support the project that we would submit to the state of Connecticut. The plan is to do a referendum in November, fall of this year. I think the date is to be determined, but it'd be this fall. Statutes allow for referendum towns. It allows you to submit a grant application in June, and as long as you hold a referendum and report the results by November 15th, it would still be valid. In between June and November, there's some statutory non-advocacy periods that bond council will advise on. Basically, we can't promote with public funds the project for that. But should the referendum go forward and it be passed, that's the blue star. I'm just going to use my pointer here. So if you see this blue star, this represents early November. That is really the start in earnest of the project. If it's passed, that's when the state says all costs for the project are now eligible for reimbursement and you can move forward. And really the first steps of that after that is having a building committee, which would have to be developed, established. We go out for professional services, architect services, owner's project manager services, and eventually construction manager and a bunch of others at that point. That takes about 3 months. And then this blue bar here is really when the design work starts in earnest. That's when they start verifying program, putting together floor plans. And it's a process. And within that process, there's a lot of steps to make sure, are we tracking on budget? Are we maintaining on schedule? Et cetera, making sure that those plans conform to the educational specifications that the Board of Education will pass. That eventually evolves into going to bidding. So we anticipate this project going out to bid at the end of 2027. It's about a 16, 18-month design process. Again, we have to go back to the state of Connecticut and request permission to go out to bid. We just can't go out. They have to review that. And then in late 27, early 28, construction would start, and we anticipate about an 18-month construction period. This building is approximately 80,000 square feet per the ed spec. We've constructed many elementary schools of similar size, quality, et cetera, in Connecticut. And that's about the sweet spot for that. At Kelly, as we noted, the plan would be to construct in the back of the existing school. It's a fairly large parcel, about 25 acres, if I remember correctly. So we've done other projects with similar size, similar type of construction on an occupied site. It would be completely fenced off. Construction would be isolated to itself while the existing school remains in operation. And that's really one of the pros of building the new versus renovating, is that's completely isolated. Again, brand new construction with today's current methods, energy efficiency, all the inspections. There's a lot of inspections required for these facilities to ensure that the quality is there, new mechanical systems, et cetera, for that. We'd anticipate completing it basically in the spring of 2029. We have to make sure the build's substantially complete so we can, after that, we also have to bring in furniture, equipment, allow the principal, staff, and administration to come in and get the space ready for the students to come in the fall of 29. And that's the most exciting time, is, when we can move in. And then during that summer, we would flop, and basically the contractor would take the old building and start demolishing it and establishing the rest of the site there. So that's that orange bar for Kelly. And then sometime in 28, 29 is that the south end, the fit out. That bar might move a little bit, but that's when we'd want to have that ready. So when we go to redistrict, that's ready for the fall 2029 as well. So, and this big yellow bar here is basically representing the redistricting that Patrick spoke about. And the green bar here is basically establishing fields, letting the grass grow. It takes about a year after we occupy to do that. So probably, what a lot of folks are most interested here is, what do we anticipate the cost? So for the scenario D 2025 referendum, we did a comparison. We have the new, which is being proposed. And on the right column, we did some renovations, and I'll walk you through those. So for the Kelly Elementary School, the total project budget is we're calculating $66.4 million. Now, the total project budget just constitutes the construction, what it's going to take to build it, establish a site. It also includes escalation to the midpoint of construction, because I think we've all seen through COVID, there is escalation. It's real. It also includes the cost for new loose furniture, equipment, the MDF room, the data room, basically the brains of the building. It'll also include playground equipment as well. It'll also include all the fees, the cost to design it, to manage the project, to do the testing. There's a lot of different components, what we call fees and expenses, that are required: permits, printing, advertising, financing costs, but most importantly, also the owner's contingency. We're going to need a pot of money for unforeseen conditions that come up in the field for that. So all of those components go into the total project budget. It's not just construction. As we were saying, we're going to submit a grant commitment. The fiscal year 25 reimbursement is approximately 44%. It'll change. We'll be in fiscal year 26. It doesn't change too much, but we don't know that number right now, but it's usually pretty close to that. The district share, we estimate to be about $39 million to the taxpayers. And that's really, what everybody wants to know is what's it going to cost us. That does have potential to decrease with some space standards that we'd have to apply for, but that's a fairly conservative estimate on the high side that would cost the district. The lower end build out, we estimate it's the same in either scenario, about $7.5 million with an estimated district share of about 4.1. That's subject to verification with the state of Connecticut to make sure they would participate in that. We believe they will, but we still have to talk with them to confirm that. With a total cost for the referendum for this year, if it goes through, approximately $74 million with an anticipated district share of about $43 million for that. Just to compare, they want to know, well, instead of building new, what if we renovated those? Would it be cheaper? So to renovate the existing Kelly Elementary School, we estimate about $60 million. However, that would consist of doing an addition to provide the square footage needed. The existing school is not big enough to provide the space necessary for the enrollment projected in the ed specs. So there would be an addition and then renovating the rest. And as I think for anybody who is involved with the project for, I think the 2 middle schools back in 2014, renovating an occupied space, especially in an elementary school, can be stressful on the staff and administration, some on the kids. I think probably most importantly to you all, the parents, there's that large concern of having construction directly next door. Our contractors are very safe. They're some of the best in the country, but again, it's still construction in an occupied school. It also takes longer, probably around 6 to 8 months longer to do a renovation because we're taking parts of the building at a time. We're playing kind of shuffling around the building as we go for that. In the district share, that's about 35 million. So it's about 4 million less to renovate. South End, that build out is the same in both scenarios. That doesn't change. And we would estimate about the referendum be about 68 million and the total district share be about 40. So we're looking about roughly 5 or so million more to build a new school. We listed some of the pros. Building new, we've seen it in other districts. You're getting that brand new piece of paper and you're designing your facility and your spaces to 21st century learning. Learning these days, as superintendent and the board can tell you, it's much, much different than probably most of us went to school. It's no longer simple classrooms, desks in rows and columns. It's very dynamic. There's a lot of support spaces in our current schools, reading intervention, math intervention, special education, breakout spaces. Just the learning pedagogies are much, much different than they were many years ago. If we walked you through, I don't know if anybody's went through a new school, if you walk through a new one, you'd be amazed at just how they're designed, how energy efficient they are, how comfortable they are. And the student, they're just better learning environments. The teachers across the state are amazing. We have great education in Connecticut, but the facilities definitely help that with it. So the cons, again, renovating an occupied space. It's a 60s era building, as Pam said. Mechanicals are outdated. We've all seen what happened with COVID, with indoor air quality. There's new regulations coming on board for that. These new systems, any of the new buildings that we either built new or renovated during COVID, they didn't have any problem with air turnover. Me and Peter, we talked about that when it came about and going, what can we do to bring in fresh air? These buildings didn't have a problem with it. They just went in the computer, they brought in fresh air, and it just turned over the air and exhausted it overnight. So when the kids came back in, that building was fresh and ready to go for those students with that. So that's that's just the phase one referendum. The referendum number 2, that would be Darrenowski, a brand new Darrenowski, in lieu of renovating it because the existing Darrenowski is very large. and we don't need that much space for the projected enrollment. That's estimated about 82 million. We did a test fit in the field that's behind the school years ago, and that property would host a school pretty well. The district share there would be about 54 million, again, using the current reimbursement rate. Karen Smith Academy, that would be either a new addition or a new structure at the site. We're estimating that to be about 18 million. District share, that's to be determined. We have to talk with the state and see what their participation in that program would be. It's constantly changing. And that total referendum currently is estimated approximately $100 million with a district share of 54.1. These numbers, we haven't included the demolition of Darrenowski because it's to be determined what the town's going to do with that. We had estimate that to be right now about $11 million if it was to be demolished. So that number's not included because that's going to be determined. Similar to the 25 referendum, comparing it to renovation, renovating all of Darrenowski is about 106 million. That's 125,000 square foot building. The proposed Darrenowski is roughly around 80,000. So there's about 45,000 square feet of additional space there. That district share would be much higher at 77.5 million. Again, Karen Smith Academy, the same, and the total referendum, 124 million versus 77.5. So you can see the renovation in this case is much higher in this scenario. So just kind of sum up the total recommended cost for the new scenario. We already walked through the details, but this total scenario is total project budget is about $174 million if both referendums pass, with an estimated district share of just under 100 million. So what's interesting, if you go back to those slides that Pam was sharing and the projected costs for just to maintain your buildings as are, keep them warm, dry, and safe without any educational improvements, without any space improvements, I think it was 116, Pam, $116 million. And then at the end of 10 years, you're doing it over again. Again, the buildings are well maintained, but the mechanical systems are tired, the electrical systems are tired for that. So that's why we kind of do those facilities conditions assessments to compare both of those over the span. And again, there's always going to be maintenance costs in a new building as well. It's not maintenance free, but it does provide a better environment for it. Then we also did a scenario. Okay, what if we kept all three schools in the status quo and renovated those as they were with the projected enrollments stay as is? And so for Kelly, with the future enrollment's about 319 students. That's about 37 million, with about estimated 20 million for the district share. Darrenowski, if we did a fall 28 for just Darrenowski, that's about, again, 106 million with 76 million of a district share. Karen Smith Academy, again, 18 million. And then keeping Flanders, we're assuming a fall 2031 referendum, another 3 years beyond that. Total project budget about 46 million, with a district share of about 28 million. And again, we've incorporated escalation into each of these projects that go out to the midpoint of those years. So kind of compare the two, the preferred scenario D versus I'll say the status quo. To renovate 207 million with an estimated district share of 124 million roughly. Looking at scenario D, total project budget about 174 million with an estimated district share of 97 million. And this last row down here is the delta. So we estimate to status quo to keep those and renovate about $33 million total more, and about another 27 million more to the district. Again, these are estimated values for that.
I'll wrap this up here. So just to kind of conclude, in summary of all of our work, why is scenario D being recommended? Really it comes down to efficient operations, both from a educational and a financial standpoint. So it will allow for the efficient use of space across all of your elementary schools within that target range. As Chuck had noted, it will result in lower overall capital costs compared to undertaking 3 major construction projects. and tens of millions of dollars in savings over the cost or over the life of the project. And then in addition, the operational cost savings of just operating one fewer school compared to the status quo. So again, to get back to kind of the Goldilocks analogy, we were really trying to build just the right amount of space to align with the enrollment, while also being sensitive to the district and community's financial needs. And again, the south end fit out ended up being much more cost effective than building a larger Darnowski, because we can take advantage of the existing building's roof. We're not going to have to dig a new foundation for that. So really a cost effective way of adding that space across the district. And then parity. As we kind of kicked off this presentation, it was about bringing those last facilities up to the same standard as your other facilities, being able to address some of those other needs around shrinking the size of Darnowski, which is very large, being kind of an added benefit. With that, I'll turn it back to the chair. Thank you.
Mr. Medancy, how do you want to handle questions from the board first?
If the board has any questions, we would start there, and then there is an agenda item for public comment.
Public comment,
If anybody
right.
had any further questions or comments? One of the things that we are planning for as well is people may have questions but not be prepared to either ask them tonight, or we may not have the answers for you on the spot tonight. So on our website, there is a submit a question button. I'll send that out to all families tomorrow, that you'll be able to submit a question, and we'll populate the questions and answers as they come in, so that, they're very often there are questions that are duplicated. And so if you can see if a question's already been asked and answered, that information saves us from having to research that more than one time. Additionally, tomorrow morning, tonight's presentation, the slide decks, and there's also more comprehensive reports relative to the enrollment facilities study, as well as the facilities condition assessment that will be online as well, that if you really wanted to get into the weeds and look at that, along with tonight's slide deck. So everything will be available to everybody. First thing tomorrow morning, it's ready to go, teed up. So with that said, I turn it over to you and any questions the board may have.
Okay. Since I saw Mr. Brown first, Mr. Brown.
Yes, something doesn't fit for me. I see a $755,000 annual savings for staffing by closing Flanders. I see over 10 years projection that our student population will actually go up. So my question is, and I don't know who to ask this of, will services to students be reduced if that much of a staffing reduction is made? And this is at a time, in our last couple of years with our budget, we talked about not perhaps having enough support personnel for currently, if we're going to have a almost $1 million reduction a year in staffing, with again, our student population going up, not down, are we reducing the services we can offer to our students?
I can speak to that. So my office worked on those estimates, and there are assumptions built into them. These are only estimates. I would say some of the things that you would realize is some positions like whether it would be a custodian, whether it would be a front office secretary, an office clerk, an administrator, a school nurse. You don't know if they would be reassigned to other buildings, depending on what the final enrollment in the other buildings looks like once redistricting occurs. But in addition to that, and this is something this board is very aware of, we often have schools with less sections. I'll use South End as an example, where there's only 2 sections per grade level. It only takes 1 or 2 students to have to open a 3rd section and have tremendously low class sizes in those classrooms, where that goes back to the capacity. And we're not necessarily maximizing the capacity of that building with 3 sections and only 13 students in a classroom. You would gain some of those efficiencies when you close a building and you add sections. So if you have 4 section schools, all I accounted for was potentially the loss of 3 certified staff in terms of the amount of sections. One of the things I've been cautioned about with other superintendents is it's a bit of the exact term he uses, fool's gold, to talk about staffing savings. First of all, as you all know, you do the budget with me every year. You only get that savings once, and then your budget, that's your new baseline year over year. So it's not necessarily a $1 million a year savings. It's going to be $1 million once. And then your salary line in your next budget works off of that baseline. The second part of it is that our student to staff ratio would remain the same, right? Just because we're closing a school, we're not eliminating all the students that are in the school. And so there's also a misnomer that if you close a school, why aren't you cutting 30 positions and just redistributing the kids to all of the other schools and the other classrooms? And that it doesn't work that way, because as you know, we're building a larger Kelly, we're building out to South End. But then at the same time, we'll be looking at the capacity of all of our buildings to figure out, are we using our buildings to the best of their capacity? And that would determine some of the movement that would occur at that time.
Hold on,
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm not sure if this question may be for the Collier group, but I noticed on page 9 that the new schools, they're getting built out? Is HVAC included in there?
I couldn't hear his question.
Yeah, would you mind repeating that?
So on the new school, the proposed new schools, so this
Yes.
would be Darrenowski, KSA, right, and Kelly. Those schools are gonna have AC for the kids?
Yes, they're fully air conditioned, new air conditioning, fresh air systems, exhaust. Yes.
And so, just out of curiosity, because the number is big, I think the mechanical is the largest out of them all. So out of that 41 million, is there a associated cost with that build out for the AC?
I'd have to break that out. Typically what we've seen in similar schools, and I can get better information to you, but typically for mechanical systems, they range anywhere from $65 to $80 per square foot for the mechanical systems. All depends on the type. There's probably 3 or 4 primary systems that we can use. One of them we use predominantly, they call it a VRF system. We're currently seeing that around a $65 to $70 per square foot. So if you were to, take that and multiply by the, 80,000 square feet, probably, if I got my numbers right, 7 times 8, 5.66 million roughly for a new system. That's kind of guerrilla math, but I can give you a better breakout on that later.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And if I could, one more question, just ancillary to that. So if we are, to Mr. Brown's point, it doesn't seem like the math is mathing on the enrollment. So on KSA, is there any data in here on the KSA enrollment and the historical data on that about where we are and what the students need there?
There are no enrollment projections at this point for the Karen Smith Academy. Right now, we run anywhere between 40 and 60 students annually there. It tends to increase as the school year progresses. And part of, I think, what he spoke to, which is why we didn't know the district share, is because we would have to talk with the state around the space standard related to a school like that, because by design, it's a lower student to staff ratio. And so while and the way that the state determines the space standard is so many square feet allotted per student. But they don't take into account the alternate design of that program. So that would be closer to the time that we apply for the Karen Smith Academy, a conversation with the state to see if we would get some sort of exception to the space standard, given the specialization of the program.
Thank you, Mr. Superintendent.
Mrs. Carmody,
Yes, I have 2 questions.
can you speak in the microphone, Mrs. Carmody?
When we have on page
gotta go to the mic.
7,
Mrs. Carmody, can you use the microphone, please, so
Oh,
everybody
I'm
can hear your
sorry.
question?
on page 7, we talk about why close Flanders. And one of the things that kind of bothers me, the whole thing bothers me about closing any school, especially a neighborhood school, because I happen to be one person that is completely advocate of that. It says here, it's less conducive to new construction, which I don't understand. You cannot build new on current school location due to the lack of available swing space. So could you explain that to me?
Sure. So it comes down to what Chuck had mentioned before of if you were to do a project at Flanders,
Yeah.
we'd really be limited to renovating and expanding the existing building with the kids
Be
in the
limited to
building.
what?
So swing space would mean you move the kids out or you build a school offsite and the kids
There's
can
plenty
stay in
of
the
space
building.
there.
So if you were to, the existing school is in kind of the ideal position on the site, just given the access. So we would either have to move Flanders out somewhere, which the district doesn't have space, or there'd have to be a renovation and expansion of that building with the kids still in the building, which would be kind of the con of having the construction zone and education happening.
So that's what swing space means?
So swing space would mean moving the kids out
Right,
to another
okay.
building while construction's happening.
Well, being very familiar with Flanders and the property there, it seems to me that there's quite a bit of property there that you could probably keep the kids in school and still build out.
You would have to likely build on the ball field to the south.
Yeah, I mean,
Which-
there's a lot of space there.
Yeah, you have the one access point currently, which is also kind of the challenge. It's not going to be impossible, but it's a less ideal site than.
And another question about Flanders, if you don't mind,
Yeah,
okay?
sure.
On one recommendation, I see that we would save, by closing Flanders, approximately $1 million annually. The majority of that, going back to page, that's on page 19, but if I go to page 7, the majority of that is in staffing reduction.
Yeah, so I'll turn that
And
to
he
the
explained
superintendent.
that,
Yeah.
and I don't know if I buy that explanation, Steve. So that's my own opinion, but
So the numbers we used for all of the operating expenses are actual expenditures from our line items. It's a 5-year average of our heating costs, our sewer and water, the buildings and grounds. So those are actual numbers. The staffing is the only piece that I shared with you, which I said is not an absolute. It's only an estimate because you wouldn't know what your staffing projections at your other elementary schools would look like in terms of the amount of sections needed per school until after the redistricting occurs.
okay, thank you. I have this sincere feeling that neighborhood schools should stay the way they are. So therefore, all of this bothers me. I just want you to know that that's where I'm coming from.
Mhm.
I understand the financial aspects of it and where we would be saving and so forth, but there are too many things on that that bother me terribly.
Understood.
Okay?
Yep.
Mr. Bijewski?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, two questions. As we talk about building a new Karen Smith Academy, which I can't stress enough that that's been essentially long overdue, considering we're operating out of a maintenance facility essentially for Darrenowski. What is the square footage roughly that is proposed for a building like that for 40 to 60, I guess, high school age students?
I believe we're carrying, we had a high and a low, 10 to 20,000 square feet. We'd have to, we haven't drafted the ed spec for that to exactly what it looked like, but that's where we're estimating that range.
Okay. And then, because again, like my question then would be, well, do we have other pieces of property in town that could essentially accommodate that? Because again, from the very beginning of these discussions, having gone to Flanders myself and being a walker and, again, being in housing areas that are actually affordable to new families coming into town. I can't stress enough, I think, the importance of that neighborhood school. I know we keep referring to that. Granted, Darrenowski was originally a high school. It's on a main road. Again, I kind of look at this recommendation of scenario D, again, a new Kelly makes sense because we have the ability to build on that property while we're still utilizing the school. Expanding South End, again, makes sense because we're able to, it seems in a relatively easy way to add additional classrooms. And then we're talking about closure of Flanders. And again, being familiar with construction and everything else, well, if we close Flanders, and essentially this is before we even talk about a new Darrenowski or anything else, well, now we can make accommodations of all the students in the district to the existing buildings and now close Flanders. Well, again, if Flanders doesn't have an appropriate site to build instead of where it currently sits, well, why wouldn't we just tear down the building and utilize the footprint to what's already there? And I would imagine there'd be cost savings because now it's essentially a building that already exists. So the foundation work and everything else, I would assume that it would be similar to where it currently sits. So have we explored that option, or is that something that we kind of didn't talk about?
So just make sure I understand the question correctly. So we're talking about the Karen Smith Academy, basically relocating it at the Flanders site. Is that, am I understanding that
it's
correctly?
more like the Karen Smith Academy. Is Darrenowski the only site for that? That's like part one of the question. And then part two of my question was, if we're planning on closing Flanders after a new Kelly is built and South End is expanded, why couldn't we potentially close Flanders and then work on a new build, tear down, new construction during the closure, and then reopen?
So I think the first question is yours from operations.
Yeah. We did not explore another site for the Karen Smith Academy because based on conversations with the current director and people very familiar with that school, a majority of the students that go to that school are located close distant proximity to that school. There's a decent walking population, a neighborhood population that goes to Karen Smith Academy. To find open space downtown similar, there is none.
I mean, we just acquired a very beautiful parcel right downtown Southington. Right. So, I mean, the Bank of America property, right?
Well, that that building has been walked through.
It needs to be torn down, which is what I'm saying. Like,
Yeah.
now we have a vacant building that could essentially be utilized for, again, a very important.
Yeah. So the goal would be just to move it off the Darrenowski property down the street?
Well, again, like I'm talking about what if we take Darrenowski out of the picture? What if that one was essentially the one to be closed because of just the vast size of it, the expense for demolition and everything else? If we could accommodate building in the other schools,
I see what you're saying.
then that's also a valuable piece of property.
Mhm.
So essentially, instead of, you know, again, like I don't know what the development potential for that site would be, but again, like, do we need that site currently, which is really not in a neighborhood per se?
Yeah, I think the conversation when we discussed closing Darrenowski was twofold, but one was the population density also downtown with proximity to Darrenowski, and that you would really then be moving students uptown to Flanders and away from the downtown area, which would not only, obviously have an impact on the area of downtown and not having a neighborhood school down there, but it would also increase your transportation costs because there are a lot of students there that are walkers right now, given the population density that you'd be busing to surrounding schools. It was discussed.
Mr. Darrenowski.
I haven't heard any mention about any preschool activities at the elementary. I know that we're somewhat limited to space with posted, I think, at Hatton School, and also any of the special ed needs that would be needed at Kelly or even South End. Is any discussion pertaining to that taken care of?
So I can speak to the capacity study piece. We did reserve the classrooms for pre-K at Hatton and Strong, as well as incorporated any of the special program space into the capacity. So the SLC, CLC rooms, I think we loaded at 5 students because of the student needs there. And then for the building projects, the ed specs do include the special program rooms at Darrenowski and Kelly. I believe it's just replacing existing at current. But those are all accounted for as part of the educational specifications, all those support services as well.
Because I think at Darrenowski we have a tenant that's in that building, and is that going to be accommodated also? Or?
Great question. So that's a conversation we would need to have at that time with the state. You're right in terms of their tenant, but they're also the first and the only state funding early childhood care program in Southington. And so our anticipation is that we would get an exemption called a notwithstanding order to add space and continue to host them as a tenant. As far as preschool at large, if you've been following this legislative session, there's mixed reviews right now whether the governor's proposal for the $300 million endowment to start universal preschool will survive this legislative session. There is a will to provide money for early childhood education, but to what extent and what that model would look like, it wouldn't necessarily all fall on the schools. A lot of what we're hearing right now is that a lot of the childcare providers around us and preschools around us would be part of that effort. We have seen instances in the past where the state would pass legislation when we're already past the point of a scenario, which at that point we would then have to consider if universal preschool is coming, where that would occur. Could that occur at Flanders then at that point? Possibly. Or and then Flanders gets repurposed as a school. I've seen South Windsor as the most recent example where they closed a school and then had to reopen it or reuse it because of some unforeseen development that occurred and their population expanded after they had a massive development occurring in their community.
One more question. I know we had some discussion some weeks back pertaining to the referendum and that our town charter limits the amount of debt the town can take. Does this referendum, will that fall within the scope of the charter restrictions?
Yes, originally we actually, the recommendation of the committee was to see if we could do Darrenowski and Kelly at the same time, especially if we were building a new Darrenowski behind the existing Darrenowski. That did put us over the 9.5% by quite a bit in the year 2031. And so we would certainly be exceeding the debt service policy at that point. And so by staggering them, that's how we got to the recommendations we did relative to the years each referendum would occur. It's to allow us to stay under the debt service.
Mr. Carson.
Thank you, Chair. First, question for our superintendent, if you know, and the current operational costs of Karen Smith Academy.
I can get that for you.
Okay, great. And then my second question, as Mr. Darrenowski just talked about with the debt service, we had originally talked about as a committee to try and do both of the new construction at the same time. Obviously, we were not able to do that because of debt service. Was there in-depth conversation and why was the decision made to move forward with Kelly instead of Darrenowski first, being that Darrenowski is the majority of the project cost in building out new schools in the district?
I think it has to do right now with Kelly's school and the mechanicals and the need in terms of the timelines associated with it. While Darrenowski is an older building and it certainly has, lived beyond its useful life, we have to remember that there have been times over the years that, especially when it was retrofitted, let's say, to go from a high school to an elementary school, there was some plumbing work done on the schools. There was some, minor cosmetic work, some tile work, some locker work, things like that. Whereas Kelly is literally the original building, minus maybe some switch to LED lights. And that's about it.
Okay, just a follow-up comment to that. I mean, we did hear from both Pam and Chuck that Darrenowski has the biggest operational inefficiency out of all our buildings. So it costs us the most on a year-to-year basis. That's my only point with that.
Yeah. And it's understood, but I think what she emphasized was it's because it's more square footage. And so that's one of the reasons for it. And I think the other thing is the community needs to have a larger, longer conversation about the Darrenowski property as a whole. You know, building another Darrenowski school is one thing, but then is it going to be on the existing Darrenowski property? Is it going to be behind it? Are we going to sell the existing building to a developer? You know, I think those are questions that the committee didn't have answers to. Whereas we did have a pretty straightforward answer for Kelly Elementary School. It's a great lot, it's a great site, it's due. Let's move.
Mr. O'Shana.
Just a couple of things. I think as the whole neighborhood school thing is a big deal, right? Both from the board, from the committee. I mean, that actually, when we got into the discussion of size in the neighborhood schools, it actually changed the trajectory of the project. Because I don't think anybody was willing to look at building mega schools. Nobody wants a mega school in town. So I think that's something that regardless of whatever direction we go in, that's going to have to be kept in mind. But going back to the question that Mr. Brown first raised and has discussed a couple of times, one of the things when we talked about this is if a school did close, the staffing from that school, the majority, if not all of the staffing would have to be, it wouldn't be eliminated. It would be dispersed throughout the community. So that's where I guess some of the questions are coming about this $755,000 average. I mean, we talked about maybe administration or some of the peripherals, but the educators are going to be placed in the other schools to cover the classroom that's moving from one school, if a school were to close, from one school to another, correct?
So yeah, I think part of in breaking this out, which I can share further with you all, is the staffing reductions is all associated costs with that. So it may look like a lot when you look at 755,000, but just administrator alone is 200,000. A teacher is roughly 100,000. When you're adding in health insurance, when you're adding in Medicaid, Medicare, MERS, you know, Social Security, all the associated costs, certified have some and non-certified have some. They don't share all the same costs. So we took into consideration all of the associated costs for any staff members that would be reduced. So again, even looking at a teacher, you're talking, it wouldn't be a teacher in the school necessarily the way the riffing would work. It would be the teacher with the least amount of seniority. So you're getting the least amount of savings there. And we factored in as if they were on not on a family plan, because again, new teachers often aren't coming in right on a family plan. So less savings there relative to insurance. But your custodial costs, your nursing costs, and front office staff. I did not factor in positions like social work, school psychology, math intervention, reading intervention. None of those are factored in terms of what would come of any reductions, because it goes back to the only way you'd get any efficiencies if sections changed based on capacity in a building. The services that the students need are still the services the students are going to need. And that's why I even was very hesitant on a nurse, because at the end of the day, at a larger school, you may still need that nurse. So again, these are estimates. I think that the board would have further conversations when the time came.
So I think it's important that we're not talking about reducing large numbers of teachers
not at all.
or providing the services. The services are going to be there. It's just how they're going to be allocated. Right? So the other question I have is, and this is sort of the crystal ball question, right? So in terms of funding, so we talked about if this goes on, we're not sure exactly what the percentage is going to be next year. It may change a little bit, but the way it's been going over the last several years, it's been plus or minus close. But with the funding changes that are taking place in the state and in the country, have there been any conversations about what happens if the state funding gets cut dramatically based on what it's getting from the federal government, or the federal funding gets cut dramatically based on what's going on? How does this impact us if we were to go to referendum, make a commitment, and then all of a sudden we see a potential cutback in what we're actually talking? So if we're talking about a $35 million cost to the district, that may go up.
So the governor's proposed budget right now for fiscal year 26 fully funds school construction. He's made no reductions to that.
So the concern I have, of course, is that they always tend to promise a lot, right? We're supposed to be getting 100% on our special education reimbursements, and we get 60, 70%.
Yeah.
That's the concern, right? So what would happen if we were to jump into this? And we need to do something. We have to do something. But if we were to jump into this, then all of a sudden that 100% funding gets cut back to 70% funding. And then as it starts allocating out to the different districts that are going to be building, what are the contingencies for something like that? That's the crystal ball question, right?
Yeah, so a couple things wrapped into there. So with the timing, anytime you submit on a June 30 deadline and do the referendum in November. Kind of the good news is you're not going to be spending any money prior to December 15th. And December 15th is when all the applications go in. It's June 30th. OGA, State Department of Education, has to put forth what they call the priority list. That's a list of projects they recommend to the governor for consideration in the next legislative session. You're going to know if you're on that list by December 15th, which is literally a month afterwards. So say, for example, for some reason, policy change or something at the state, DAS, and that you weren't on that, you haven't spent any money. You can just say, hey, we're not doing the project, or if it differs greatly. So that from a timing perspective, your timing's good. We have not, in our experience, ever seen a project that's gone on, that's been on the list and it's always December 15th. You can look them all up. We haven't seen a project come off that list in the time that I've been in this sector for it. Two, there's been a ton of planning that's gone into this plan. It's been a well thought out plan. It's a holistic plan. The state has passed legislation that they want districts to look holistically, not it just a one-off building, but it's a whole. And I think we had talked about that with the prior director, and it's been a lot of discussion. You have a good, we feel you have a good plan, that you've looked at all the factors. That's what makes these attractive to the state. They want to help, but they want a well thought out plan. And we think this plan is very well thought out, with looking, as he said, the Goldilocks. You're building the need, not too much, not too little. And that's what they want to see. There's a proposed House bill out now that I think I distributed to the district. That is they're going to be taking potential action of revising some new statutes that are making mostly clarifications to some of the regulations that we work with. But one of them is new. One that's new out there right now is they're proposing a max limit on a cost per square foot for basically elementary, middle school, and high schools that are out there right now. That's very new. We're reviewing it ourselves. That would only take place. The proposal is for grant applications after July 1st of 2026. So basically talking June of 27, you'd be before that, but that's something we need to keep our eye on, because if they didn't specify if they're total project budgets that we spoke about, or if they're building costs, we need to get that clarified. If it's total project budgets, these budgets are running the $900 to $1,000 per square foot. If you look at the last priority list, they're in the $900 to $1,000 per square foot. So if you're only talking, these are in the 500 range, is what they're talking. So there's a significant, my personal opinion, I think there's going to be some pushback from legislators in towns and districts on that, but we're going to keep an eye on that. Federal funding hasn't, it's usually general obligation funds. The state takes out bonds for these, typically 20-year bonds. So it's mostly state funded. So I think the timing's right. We've planned it out. The cost per square foot we use for buildings are based upon very recent bids within the last year for an elementary school, and past ones as well. But we're constantly, staying vigilant with it and talking to the state. So, so crystal ball, I don't think it's that bleak, but anything can change. And again, when you do if you go to referendum and you pass, you'll know if you're on the prior list. So that's the good news. Once you're usually on it, we haven't seen them come off.
The only other thing, if I could circle back to Mr. Carson's question, and thank you, Mr. Romano. The other piece of the conversation, why Kelly before Darnowski, because by building a larger Kelly school, you could redistrict and not have to wait until the end of a Darnowski project to do that. Because the current Darnowski building could fit the redistricting of students in the existing building, or whether it was a new building that was right sized.
Steve, is it our goal as a board to determine whether we want to put this on the referendum in November? And if we do not put it on the referendum in November, we would lose some state money. Am I correct about that? Is that how?
So yeah, there's a few steps here. A little bit is that we kind of are on parallel tracks with new construction and redistricting. Now, redistricting has been a conversation with this board. Mr. Naroski, I think, challenged me about 8 years ago to see if we can actually pull it off someday, because we know our transportation routes and our pocket districting is kind of all over the place. But with that said, the thought process for a June 30th application now is, and Mr. Warrington just spoke about it, if the referendum passes in November, then we can get a grant commitment from the state on December 15th. If we decide not to go to referendum, then we can't submit a grant application because, well, we wouldn't, because the state wouldn't put you on the priority list on December 15th without any guarantees of the town doing their share of the funding relative to a past referendum. So the only thing that would then happen is, if you took no action for this June 30th grant submission, it would happen next June 30th grant submission, and then it would be a 2026 referendum. You wouldn't hear from the state until December of 2026, which means your 2029 project is now 2030. Pushes everything out. One of the things we've talked about as a committee, each year you push out the project, we know the costs are going to escalate.
And I only asked that question because of the economic times that everyone is going through at this point. I'm sure that's going to be a question of a lot of citizens in Southington at this point.
Yeah.
And so they need to know what's going to happen if that does not get on the referendum.
Yep.
By November.
So I think twofold as well. Tonight's session was really just the board, as all our subcommittees do, personnel and policy, right? Curriculum and instruction. This is your chance to hear the recommendations of a committee and get the details. There was no action expected to be taken this evening. It was really just, your chance to gather that information, a chance for the community to hear, in a little bit more depth. If this were scheduled as just a typical Board of Ed meeting, we wouldn't be able to give it the time and justice it deserves to give you all of the information tonight as part of a regular business meeting, hence the special meeting. An opportunity for public comment this evening, but also once the information is out there, for people to submit questions right up to our next Board of Education meeting on April 10th. On April 10th, it would be up to the board whether they wanted to entertain a motion or take no action at that time towards a recommendation. The town council would need to have a bond ordinance ready for April 14th. And then at that point, if they authorize that, we start to go into the public hearing phase of this with Planning and Zoning, Board of Finance, and others, leading up to the authorization for referendum and at the very end of May. And then June 1st to June 30th, we would be working to get the grant application finalized and submitted.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So again, I'll echo a lot of what's already been mentioned up here. Obviously, there's a lot of hard work that went into the scenario and the strategy that's been presented tonight. So I appreciate that. My comments are mostly going to be tied to risks associated with the cost and schedule. So first of all, right, we've seen there's volatile construction cost. We see tariffs, financial factors, specifically, right, aluminum, steel, mechanicals. So I'm concerned that we find ourselves in a position where we may have to scale back, or what would happen if we had to go out for a second referendum in the event that the cost exceeded what was approved in a referendum. So I'm curious what escalation contingencies are included in this budget that was shown here for the estimate.
Yeah, so currently we're carrying 4.5% escalation, and we finalized these budgets back in probably December. So just prior, obviously, to all the current discussion with the administration for that. Agreed. Right now, we are getting some bids in and some other projects that we're feeling some pressure from that and a level of uncertainty in the bid market. So there is definitely concern there. This is truly that crystal ball effect of what's going to happen. And we kind of ran into this in 2022 in another district very close to you. And one of the strategies we employed, I think it would require an open discussion with this board and the town council of how do we address that? Do you create a larger contingency that's, say, in a lockbox where it only town council can, if we run that situation, there's a set pot of money that's set aside that they control, that the building committee, if the project moves forward, we're managing to the current budget. And if we run into that scenario, it's available, without having to go out to say referendum. But if it's not needed, it's just never spent and it's never bonded on. So we presented in that case, escalation, if you remember, 22 was approaching 8% inflation. So we presented to the town council 5, 6, 7, and 8%. We said, we just had an open discussion. You tell us what you want to carry, because sometimes it's perceived that we're trying to bump up the cost of the project for our own interest. It has nothing to do with us. It has to do with having enough money to complete your project and complete it with a scope. Because as you said, we don't want to do is start cutting back program, cutting back square footage, reducing this. A lot of times you're reducing the size of classrooms, which is not what you want to do. You may be sacrificing on building envelope systems, your mechanical systems, and those are death by 1,000 cuts for that. So we do have escalation in it to the midpoint of construction. We also have owner's contingency. Ideally, we're not touching that until, because again, if we're building new, we have to get into the ground. We'll be taking borings but we still don't have X-ray vision into the ground for that. So I think it would require, I'd encourage a discussion as a town as a whole to how do you control those levers so that the project continues forward? Because in the schedule, if we go out to bid and say it comes in over, there's not a lot of time to redesign, go back out to bid. You also lose bidder interest if you do that as well. They lose confidence in the projects, and that you don't want to do that either. So what I'd like to call them is having levers available to you to keep the project moving forward, but with guardrails to those levers that are safeguarded in the town. It's not just, okay, here, building committee, you have all this extra money because, you're a conservative town. I don't think it's going to happen with your building committee, but we work in a lot of districts where we see it happen. Let's put some fancy finishes here and there. I don't foresee Southington want to do that, just building a solid building. So I think there needs to be discussion on what are some of those safeguards and how can you ensure that the project moves forward in a fiscally responsible manner, but at the same time, not growing this budget where you're wasting money at the same time.
Right. So then going down that same line, right? So that kind of speaks to the contingency plan for cost. Then you get into like schedule. So if the construction delays, right? We also know there's delays in getting certain types of material. I worry about mechanicals and stuff, what have you too, because we're seeing, right, certain suppliers are no longer in the market and are in the business. So if construction delays were to go beyond 29 or 30, like, again, is there any contingency in here for the schedule? Kind of how the schedule's been proposed? Have you, is there buffer?
There's not an extensive contingency for that because if we did, you're going out to 2030. So by doing that, you're talking another year of escalation. We're saying if you waited another year just to save 4% on 60 million, or 2.5, maybe 3 million by the time you escalate that out. So those are lost dollars. So there's not a lot of time for that. Some of the strategies we do employ, in addition to an architect in throughout Connecticut, we'd recommend retaining a construction manager. I'm sure many of you folks have heard about that. Those partners are brought on as a professional service, as a partner, as a project team. And they're brought on early to not only help us estimate the project at 3 major milestones, to estimate the project against the budget, make sure we're staying within budget, value management, and so forth. But they're also keeping an eye. They're talking to our trade contractors and our suppliers to keep a temperature on what are some of the long leads. And we've incorporated strategies in some recent projects to get out ahead and do some early material releases ahead of time. So, like you said, mechanical units. That's a discussion if you have a grant commitment with the state to talk about that and go in order for us to occupy by fall of 29. We'll have a very good idea what some of those components are,
right,
not only from the lead time, but also from the cost perspective. So having the right team on board in this process with you is vital. And we've been able to successfully navigate that. I know when COVID hit, we were in the South Windsor schools, the second phase of those. Fortunately, we're mostly quite along construction, so most of the building was up, but we were able to strategize and identify any items in the building that might have been complete. We took renderings, we highlighted it, we went to the superintendent and said, are you okay operating without maybe this type of countertop or whatever the item might have been? And we got ahead of it. Fortunately, we didn't have to run into that situation, but having the right team and the foresight in these projects is vital. to their success.
Yeah, agreed. And I just think it's important that the entire board kind of keep in mind, right? Obviously, delays to the schedule would complicate redistricting, right? So that's a huge challenge. And then also I worry about, what that impact could also have on other capital projects that, that could be out in the future for the town. So the last thing I wanted to highlight too is that obviously we're showing, it looks like it's like a 6% or so student population increase over a 10-year period. And going back to what we've seen over the last couple of years, right? We've seen student population has gone down in the district by 84, but we've seen special education needs, our student population that's increased 138 students over that same time frame. So the other question that I have is that as we've estimated the budget needed for the facility spaces, have we accounted for the shift in student needs to include, obviously, having more flexible building arrangements to adapt to that ever-evolving student population need?
Yeah, the ed specs as designed would, so the current schools, I'll use Kelly as an example, doesn't really have any flexible learning space. It's very much a fixed model building. All classrooms the same size, no conference rooms, no special services rooms, things of that sort. So this would take into account, special education rooms that maybe are a modified class space in terms of the amount of square footage, speech and language pathologist office, a social worker's office, a school psych's office, spaces that just don't exist right now, or if they do, they're modified within the existing building and weren't designed for that purpose.
Okay. That's all my questions. Thank you.
Mr. Demjanowski, you had another question?
The ed spec timeline and cost, has that been determined yet?
Not for Darrenowski or Karen Smith Academy. Darrenowski, I think we have a pretty rough idea of the ed specs. For Kelly, the ed specs are done. We were thinking of going to referendum in 2023 before we paused. So they're just sitting. It was about 2 years ago that Mrs. Call met with the staff and someone who was did the ed specs for us. And so they're done, paid for and ready.
And you're going to look at it again just to make sure it's up to date with everything in place that we're looking for?
Yes. Yep. We could certainly. Yeah, we would definitely do that.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. And we're going to open it to public comment. If anyone would like to come up and speak, if you could give us your name and your address, I would ask, we're going to limit it to 3 minutes. Could you show of hands how many want to speak for the public comment? Okay. Okay, that's fine.
I'll be super quick. First of all, thank you, board members. And
Your name and address, please.
Rob Lala. I'm from Plansville. Okay. Yeah, 40 Spring Glen Road. First of all, this is incredibly hard work. Like I just sitting back here, I've been looking from afar. But number one being Darrenowski Elementary alumni, Central Elementary at the time. I know what it's like on the second floor up there. So, in August and in June. So I appreciate it. But with that being said, my own children also go to or went to a community-wide school. So I understand shutting that, what that would feel like. So I know it's rough. I had the pleasure of sitting in Ellington Public Schools Board of Ed meeting a few weeks ago, where they had just opened a elementary school where they explored an option of bringing in making a magnet type school for special education, so you could maybe defray some of the costs. So the first question would be, could we maybe explore that option so we could maybe make that a magnet type school so we can offset some of those costs? Would be my first question. And the second, doing nothing, I don't think is an option, right? We have to do something. We're literally, obviously, spending money here for these folks to do their job. I think sitting on our hands and just pretending it doesn't exist is not so. I don't envy your position right now, but I do support you guys. Thank you.
Good evening, Stephen LaCroix, East Street. I just had a question on why scenario C and D were not, why were they not elaborated? Because scenario C seemed to have less risk, less redistriction, and less costs, but we went straight to D. So is there a reason why we didn't elaborate on what the difference are between C and D?
I think the only reason for the sake of tonight's meeting is because the facilities committee had recommended scenario D, and so that's why we were highlighting that. They were both discussed more in depth at the committee level.
Okay.
Good evening, Joanne Kelleher, 861 Savage Street. First, I want to thank Mr. Darrenowski for bringing up the preschool and tenant issue. I don't need to put on my early childhood collaborative hat because of that. So I want to remind people that getting a referendum passed is not a guarantee here in this town, as we saw with the roof project of Southington High School. As someone who serves on the library board, I was the person in charge of the planning committee making the rebuild, redesign, or build new decision. And we put together a whole giant plan to get that referendum passed. We put together a political action committee. We got volunteers, we bought signs, we had marketing plans, because once the town council decides to go forward with a referendum, staff are not allowed to make recommendations to the community about which way they can vote. They can provide information. And so I want to remind the Board of Ed members that you guys are going to need to step it up for this referendum, because I didn't see that happening with the roof project. And it's a lot of work. And if you want to reach out about how we did it with the library, let me know. Thanks.
Good evening, Ryan Dumont, 89 Hitching Post Drive. Thank you, to the Board of Ed and to Superintendent. Just a couple questions. First, I think our kids do deserve 2 brand new schools if it comes down to that. Selfishly, I would not want to see Flanders School closed down, as I put 4 kids through Flanders and we're all happen to be walkers. And this question is probably not for the Board of Ed, but maybe for the town council. But if the neighborhood, if we had some idea of what the land would be used for after, open field, park, something, I think we'd feel more comfortable just as a neighborhood about what's going to happen with that land afterwards. So I don't know if you want to speak to that or if that's more of a town council question.
Generally, we don't answer questions during public comment, but I can say that we haven't gotten to that point.
Okay.
As far as discussing, there's possibilities for that piece of land, but we haven't gotten to that point yet. And that would be something that the town would be deciding.
Do you know at what point that would be first discussed?
Yeah.
So once redistricting were to occur and Flanders was no longer being used by the school system, they would vote to turn it back over to the town.
Okay.
And at that point, that's when the town discussion would occur in terms of future use of the property.
Okay.
So would it be until 2029?
Okay. Okay. And then,
well, I take that back. Redistricting would be in 2028. So if it's that we are closing it in 2029, then they could probably at that point start the conversations.
Okay. I guess in the past, it always, it was, and thank you for all the communication to the board and to the superintendent. It was always communicated that it was probably impossible to build a new school at Flanders, but what I'm hearing tonight, it's not impossible, it was just not feasible or like you don't get the most cost savings of doing that because of the hourglass shape of the property. But hopefully we explored that a little bit more in depth, or maybe we need more time, or maybe that ship has sailed because of the timing of everything. So that's it. Thank you.
My name's Tom Spooner. I live on Skipper Lane, and you've answered a couple of my questions with Flanders School. My children went to Flanders. My grandchild goes to Flanders right now. They've always walked. They've walked to Darrenowski. They've walked to high school. And my question is, If you do close Flanders, who's responsible for the maintenance of the property and the sidewalks in the neighborhood? As far as snow removal, I mean, we have many town leagues, baseball, football, soccer practices on the property. Would the Board of Education still be responsible, or are we going to find some asbestos possibly in a window caulk or something like that and sell it for $1 and let a developers take it down and put houses on the property? That's my first concern. And my other concern is, has the town looked into possibly relocating these schools, the students, into a Catholic school like they do in other schools in town, as far as knocking down sections of the school, have the students go to a Catholic school. I don't know if St. Thomas is still available. If you could put the student, at least that for a couple of years, and put the children in there, the students in there, and then have them come back to the schools after the project is completed. And another thing is, how much of this, if we do build new schools, how much of the product in construction material is built in the United States with the 25% tariff on everything that's made out of this country's computers, gypsum, sheetrock, concrete, steel, and aluminum? Has that been estimated into the cost of new construction? Thank you.
Hi there. Lauren Markier, Sunny Slope Drive in Plantsville, Arlington area. Question slash, I'm not sure if you guys touched on it, your recent estimates that you did for numbers coming into schools. Did that include the kiddos that, you know, this past year we had to create a 5s classroom now? So are these numbers, obviously this coming fall, we have a lot more kids coming in where now certain schools have to do 3 kindergarten classrooms. Was that included in estimates that you guys did? Because I think you said your most recent estimate was.
Yeah, he used current enrollment coupled with the birth rate, so and then the incoming case. But right now, our registration process is still ongoing.
Right.
So we don't have the actual incoming K enrollment. So typically what we do, just like we do for budgeting, we roll over the current year enrollment, and then we adjust it once we know what it is after registrations are complete.
Right, okay, because I guess what I'm thinking is the current enrollment kind of decreased for kindergarten this year
Mhm.
due to kids staying an extra year. So if there is going to be that many more kids included in the next coming years, was that accounted for in your?
Yes.
Okay. And then to kind of go off what the first gentleman said, if you guys are thinking of closing Flanders, I guess just a thought to keep in mind. As one of the chairmen said, we do have such increasing numbers of kids with special needs in the town. Has it been thought about, you know, these kids on a daily basis might have a difficult time just transitioning from one classroom to the next within the school that they're already in? Well, now imagine taking these kids out of that school and putting them in a new school. So maybe the idea of doing a magnet school for kids with special needs might be a good idea, if it's obviously possible. But thinking about the kids with special needs at that School of Flanders, I think is a very important thing to discuss, personally.
Thank you. Anyone else? Anyone else want to make a comment? Seth?
Seth Corn, Yorktown Road. Madam Chair, Board of Ed members, Superintendent Medancy, and your administrative team. I am a parent of 2 current Keller Elementary School students. Over the past several years, I've attended the parent forums, I've read the reports, I've attended the Board of Ed meetings, reached out to Mr. Medancy personally to ask questions and get clarification about this vital project for our children, school community, and town as a whole. I hope this board can finally come to a consensus on the need for this project to be moved forward and approved at your next board meeting on April 10th. as you have been presented with several scenarios on elementary school facility projects. In the past, cost is always going to rise. It continues to rise. Using tariffs as an excuse is not an excuse no longer because it was COVID last time. Some of the concerns I have brought up in the past several years in regards to Kelly School in particular that I would like to remind the board about. Students have been dismissed from school early on several occasions because of unhealthy learning conditions due to extreme heat, resulting in loss of instructional time. Play structures have been dismantled because they were deemed unsafe for our children and not replaced. And there is water leaking from the roof, which is collected with buckets. I'm going to reference Cabe and Southington Board of Education Policy 6161.3, comparability of services. The Board of Education, this is quoted, the Board of Education believes that at all times its schools should be equally as well equipped and maintained. The current condition of Kelly School is not upholding this policy and legal requirements, putting the district at risk for losing state and federal funding. If you are not convinced yet that this project needs to happen, I don't know when the last time you've been in the building, you need to visit it. That will change your decision of this proposal and plan. It has to happen. I encourage you to take a tour of Kelly, as well as Flanders and Darrenowski Elementary School. The time is now to proceed with one of the proposals presented by SLAM to the Board of Education. I encourage the chair and the Board of Ed to put forth the grant application to the state by June 2025. As I stated at your first newly elected Board of Education meeting, I want to collaborate and work with this board to see this project through. It is in the best interest of our students and community. Kelly School is long past its lifespan. I am extending my hand and hoping you are willing to work together. I am ready and willing to continue the conversation now, following this meeting, and in the weeks and months to come. Thank you for your consideration.
Any other members of the public?
Paul Chaplinsky, 63 McIntosh Way. I'm also the chair of the town council in town, and I wanted to come up at the end after everybody had a chance to speak. I too was a product of Westridge Elementary School and Kelly School now, for those who haven't been around long enough. And I think you need to, the board needs to figure out how to make something happen. Whatever you decide, you have to figure out how to take a step forward and start the process of working on addressing the last few schools, whatever that looks like, whatever your board decides. I also think it's important that you're unanimous on this. I know that that may be difficult to do, but there's been a lot of work that's been done. I think everybody in the room agrees that something needs to be done. I don't think anybody here would disagree with that. I would ask you to get in a room, figure out, where your differences are, and try to find a way to get together on something, whatever that something is, because we have to take a step forward in the town for the students and for the teachers that are teaching at these schools. That said, I don't know what the future is of whatever school that closes. If Flanders is the go forward school, I could tell you my personal opinion. I don't think there's going to be a lot of support for whoever came up earlier. I personally don't believe that there's going to be a lot of support to sell a school to a developer. I think we've all heard loud and clear that development, it's got its course, and selling a school to develop that, in my opinion, is not a good course. So I personally would fight against that. I think that we've heard some testimony from professionals, and I think that there's probably a good argument to keep the school as a school, because when I'm long gone, 20 or 30 years from now, there could be a need for that school. The enrollment could go up, and there could be an opportunity to use that school as a school again if there's an opportunity to renovate it. So I would offer that personally, I can't speak for the entire town council. I think that the school should, whatever school it is, we should consider, if it is Flanders, it should stay. And, you know, we could repurpose it for other town purposes. Maybe it's special education, maybe it's other town needs. You know, we have needs for town, for storage. It's a great area for continuing with recreational outside, recreational inside. I know elections department, for those who did early voting, we have a problem with early voting at town hall. And this has a gymnasium. It wouldn't be disruptive to have elections at a school like Flanders, early voting. It has handicap accessibility. So I think that there's some arguments that could be made in the future. I don't know what those are, so I want to make sure that I'm very clear. Again, I don't speak for any other town council members. I speak for myself as a resident, and just ask you all to please try to find a way. I think there's an opportunity to take a step forward, and I know it's not going to be easy. I know it's not going to be easy. There's going to be, you know, some anxiety about it. I think we all have to work together to try to take the step forward. Thanks.
Anyone else from the public wish to comment? Okay, I will entertain a motion.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, everybody.
First one. He's gonna pay for it. Am I wrong?
But listen, I'm not positive.